What's up, night owls? Welcome back to Demon Sleep. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I personally read every single one of them, and honestly, it makes my day seeing you all from around the world. If these dark tailies help you drift off or just escape reality for a bit, smash that like button and subscribe, but only if you think we've earned it. No pressure. Alright, lights off, rain on, blankets up. Let's dive into tonight's nightmare fuel. Story 1, you're the main course. She began before the sun had fully claimed the sky, guiding the iron with the kind of discipline that erased every crease, every flaw, every sign that human hands had ever touched the fabric. When she finished, the cloth looked untouched by life itself. The table waited in silence. She dressed it piece by piece, lifting each item with care that didn't belong to her. The linen had traveled across an ocean to get here. Its price alone could have carried her through an entire season of rent, food, and survival. But here, it existed only to catch crumbs. Next came the porcelain, wedding gifts from decades ago. White surfaces traced with delicate patterns from Hermes, so thin they almost disappeared when the light struck them. Beauty, she had learned, was often just another word for something breakable. The glasses followed. Crystal so clear it barely existed, catching the last pale strands of June sunlight that slipped through the mansion's narrow concrete openings. Those windows never welcomed the day. They rationed it. This place didn't feel lived in. It felt fortified. Today mattered. She could tell by the menu. He had requested French again. A celebration. The senator's son had finished his studies at Princeton University. 4 years, no scandals, no headlines, no disgrace. In this family, survival without embarrassment passed for greatness. She had started cooking hours ago. Butter melted into the pan, releasing a richness that filled the air. The sound of the meat meeting heat was sharp, almost violent. She added the liquor next, watching it hiss and rise in a fragrant cloud. The smell wrapped around her. Warm, comforting, cruel, because without warning, another memory pushed its way in. Her own kitchen, her own boy, his laugh, then the hospital, then the silence. He would have been older than Caleb now, but he never reached that age. He never sat at a table like this. He never tasted food like this. He died with nothing inside him, but chemicals someone else had handed him. Chemicals that traced back, in quiet ways, to men who lived in houses like this one. She blinked and the moment was gone. By evening, everything was ready. She carried the plates out. The senator first, then his wife, then their son. Her movements were precise, practiced, invisible. They didn't acknowledge her. Not with their eyes, not with their voices. To them, she wasn't a person. She was a function, a pair of hands without a history. The young man smiled as he spoke, his tie perfectly knotted, his confidence effortless. He had inherited his father's sharp edges and his mother's easy cruelty. He spoke freely, laughed easily, existed without weight. He had never known hunger. She returned to the kitchen and paused beside the wine. It had been waiting for this night. She knew the bottle well. She knew all of them. Every Thursday she cleaned the shelves in the cellar, memorizing their labels without trying. This one came from Shadal Margox. Rare, valuable, saved. She had opened it early, just like she'd been told. Let it breathe. Let it become what it was meant to be. Before bringing it out, she poured a small amount into a plain kitchen glass. She stared at it for a long moment, then tipped it into the sink. Not to waste it, to make sure, to make absolutely certain that nothing was wrong with it. She had checked it twice. No mistakes, no accidents. When she carried the bottle out, it rested on polished silver, her hands steady in a way they hadn't been in a very long time. She turned the label toward the senator, giving him the quiet ceremony he expected, the silent performance of respect he had grown used to receiving from the world. He nodded, granting permission. She poured. 3 glasses. 3 futures. They raised them together. To what comes next, the senator said. Crystal touched crystal. They drank. He closed his eyes briefly as he swallowed, savoring it, searching for meaning and flavor. He spoke about texture, about depth, about legacy, using words that turned liquid into status. His wife echoed him, her agreement smooth and automatic. Their son said nothing. He didn't need to. This was normal to him. Privilege rarely announces itself. It simply exists. She stepped back into the shadows and waited. Time moved forward. They ate. They laughed. They consumed. And when the last drop was gone, when the bottle stood empty between them like a finished confession, she walked to the doors. The wood was dark and heavy beneath her hand. She slid the lock into place. The click was soft. Final. The sound reached them instantly. The senator's voice stopped mid-sentence. His wife froze. The son kept chewing for 1 heartbeat longer. Then he noticed. Then he stopped too. She turned toward them. This was the moment she had rebuilt in her mind again and again. Not once, not twice. Hundreds of times. Ever since the report arrived. Ever since strangers had reduced her child's life to a paragraph. Ever since they called it his fault. They said he had poisoned himself. They said he was careless. They said he was weak. But she knew the truth. He had been walking home in the dark after washing dishes for minimum wage. He had been tired, hungry, alive, until headlights erased him, until a speeding Mercedes-Benz turned him into paperwork, until powerful people turned that paperwork into lies. She expected to scream now. She expected her voice to break. But it didn't. When she spoke, it came out calm, almost gentle. She told them about the wine, about what lived inside it, about how invisible it had been. She explained how it would move through them, quiet at first, then unstoppable. She told them how, hours from now, their bodies would begin to betray them, how the pain would grow, how nothing would stop it. She spoke like someone describing the weather. The senator stared at her, confusion cracking into anger. His face reddened. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. His wife didn't move at all. Her stillness was deeper than shock. It was instinct. The instinct of something that finally understood it was no longer safe. Their son looked between them, between his parents, between her, and for the first time since she had known him. He looked small, very small, and in that silence, she realized something unexpected. This didn't bring her son back. It didn't fix anything. It didn't heal the hole inside her. But it did something else. It made them feel it. The helplessness, the unfairness, the end arriving without permission. She folded her hands in front of her and waited. For a moment, no one moved. Not because they didn't want to, because they didn't know how. Fear had entered the room, and it had taken a seat at the head of the table. The young man was the first to break. His breathing came in quick, shallow pulls, each one louder than the last. His hand slid down to his abdomen, fingers pressing hard, as if he could physically hold himself together. I feel it, he whispered. His voice trembled. He said it burned. His father's reaction was instant. Sharp, dismissive. That's impossible, he snapped. Control yourself. But the boy's skin had already lost its color. Sweat gathered along his hairline, clinging to him. His fingers moved to his throat, rubbing, searching, as if something inside him had changed shape. His father looked at him, not with comfort, not with concern, but with disappointment. His mother leaned forward slightly, studying him. Not like a parent, like an observer, like someone watching a theory prove itself. The senator pushed his chair back. The legs screamed against the polished floor. He began to rise. Then her voice stopped him. Calm, certain, she told him, struggling would only make it worse. He froze halfway up, his mind working, measuring. She could see it happening behind his eyes. The calculation, the risk, the possibility of hidden consequences. He lowered himself back down slowly. He understood now. This wasn't chaos. This was design. She reached into her pocket, pulled out something small. Glass, amber liquid resting inside it, thick and golden in the light. She placed it in the exact center of the table. No closer to anyone. No farther. Equal distance. Equal temptation. She explained. This could stop it. This could save one of them. But only one. Silence swallowed the room. Then everything changed. The son's hand moved first. Desperate. Instinctive. But his father was faster. His fingers clamped around the boy's wrist with brutal force. Their eyes met. And in that moment the truth surfaced. Not love. Not protection. Competition. Survival. She watched it happen. Watched the bond between them fracture under pressure. Watched legacy devour blood. She stepped away from the table, moved to the wall, sat down quietly. Her hands rested in her lap. Her heart was calm. For the first time in 372 days, they finally understood what it felt like to have something taken from them. She sat with the patience of stone. Her hands rested neatly over one another, her posture straight, her breathing even. On her wrist was the only luxury she had ever owned. A simple watch from Timex. Her son had saved for months to buy it. She remembered the way he smiled when he gave it to her. Proud, nervous, hopeful. The second hand didn't jump. It glided. Smooth. Merciless. Time was no longer something they owned. They stared at her like strangers, staring at a storm that had somehow learned their names. Then slowly, they turned on each other. The wife's lips parted, but nothing came out. Her mind was elsewhere, moving through invisible equations. Years ago, she had studied systems and markets at Wellesley College. She had learned how value was assigned, how losses were minimized, how sacrifices were justified. Those lessons hadn't left her. She was using them now. Their son reached into his pocket, fumbling out his phone, his fingers clumsy and weak. Hope, connection, escape. But it never happened. His father took it from him without hesitation. Effortless, ownership disguised as instinct. He glanced at the screen briefly before placing it face down on the table. Control restored, or at least the illusion of it. She watched him carefully. She knew that look. He was already rewriting reality in his head, already preparing the version of this night that would survive. Her boy's name surfaced in her mind. David. She let it live there for a moment. Then she spoke it aloud. Soft, clear. They didn't react. Of course they didn't. The senator had never remembered it. She knew because she had heard him once, speaking behind closed doors, reducing her son to that dishwasher kid. She told them what had really happened. how the reports had been altered, how substances had appeared in his body after he was already gone, how the story had been cleaned, sanitized, buried. She watched the senator's face carefully. It emptied. That was his tell. Not anger, not denial, calculation. His son began to cry, not with the deep, broken sound of real sorrow, but with the thin panic of someone encountering consequence for the first time. He whispered for his father, a child again. The wife gripped the table, her fingers pale, her breathing sharp and fast. When she finally spoke, her voice held together by force alone. How do we know? She asked. She swallowed. How do we know any of this is real? Her eyes flicked to the vial, to the poison, to the cure, to any of it. A small smile touched the corner of the old woman's mouth. Not cruel, not kind, just certain. You don't, she said quietly. The words settled over them like falling ash. She tilted her head slightly. But it's all you have. Silence filled the space between heartbeats. Her fingers brushed the face of her watch, and she said his name again. David. She let his name leave her mouth slowly. David. It hung there, alive in a room that had helped erase him. She told them about the choice she'd faced, about the paper that claimed her son had poisoned himself, about the words printed in cold ink that tried to turn him into someone she didn't recognize, and about the truth she carried instead. Her boy had watched his father drink himself into an early grave. He had seen what addiction did. He had sworn, with the fierce certainty only the young possess, that he would never surrender himself to anything that could steal his will. She had believed him, but belief meant nothing against power. She had no money, no voice anyone important could hear. So the lie had won. She looked at them carefully. But tonight, she said, belief matters again. Her wrist turned. The watch face caught the chandelier light. 47 minutes. Time was thinning. The room itself seemed to feel it. The food sat abandoned, its warmth long gone. The rich sauce had stiffened into something dull and lifeless. The air, once fragrant, now felt heavy, almost rotten. A fork dragged across porcelain. The sound cut through everyone. Outside, the day had fully disappeared. The only light left came from above, harsh and artificial. It bleached the life out of everything beneath it. This wasn't a dining room anymore. It was a waiting room. He stood. The senator crossed to the cabinet without asking permission, retrieving a bottle he had once described proudly as rare. He poured himself a measure, amber liquid catching the light as it fell. He drank, not for pleasure, for control. When he turned back, his face had settled into something familiar. Authority. He began to speak, his tone measured, almost instructional. He explained his value, his importance, his necessity. He spoke of finances, of assets, of obligations only he could fulfill. Without him, he said, everything would collapse. His wife stared at him, her face hollowed by the words. He wasn't asking. He was concluding. Their son shot to his feet, so fast his chair crashed behind him. No, he said. It came out broken. The young man's perfect image had begun to crack. His tie hung loose. His hands shook openly now. His father didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. Instead, he reminded him, quietly, carefully, of the things he had done, of the mistakes that had vanished before they could become consequences, of the night a car had struck someone crossing the street, of how money had turned tragedy into paperwork, of how influence had turned guilt into freedom. The words hit harder than any blow. The son's face collapsed. He understood. He wasn't being protected. He was being measured. And he was coming up short. Across the room, she watched them unravel. Watched truth strip away everything they had hidden behind. Her fingers rested over her watch again. The second hand moved forward. Smooth, unstoppable. David had stood alone too. And no one had saved him. The truth didn't just land. It spread. It moved across Caleb's face like flame finding dry paper, folding him inward. His mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. His eyes went to his mother, pleading, begging her to interrupt this, to deny it, to restore the version of the world he understood. She didn't. She couldn't. She was staring at the small glass vial, staring at it the way people stare at cliffs. She rose slowly. Her hands moved over her skirt, smoothing invisible wrinkles, clinging to ritual, because ritual was the only thing still holding her together. When she spoke, her voice carried a strange clarity. She began listing her worth. Not in love, not in memories, in utility. She spoke of the events she had hosted, the rooms she had filled, the powerful people she had entertained and charmed and persuaded. She described the invisible labor of influence, the careful maintenance of relationships that had helped build everything they had. She described herself as infrastructure, essential. Her husband listened, his head tilted slightly. Not like a partner, like a buyer. When he answered, his tone was thoughtful, detached. He explained that she was no longer irreplaceable. He spoke of time, of age, of decline. He mentioned the possibility of someone new, someone younger, someone more effective. The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. They hollowed her out all the same. He even mentioned her drinking. A small comment, a surgical cruelty. She stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. Across the table, he poured himself another drink. Still calm, still certain. He spoke again, explaining that emotion could not guide this decision. Emotion was inefficient. Emotion was weakness. Their son grabbed his arm. Hard, desperate. The contact meant nothing. He shook him off immediately. Annoyed, dismissive. Then he said something worse. He said his son could be replaced too. That legacy could be rebuilt. That heirs could be created. But power was different. Power was singular. Power was the only thing that mattered. Each word struck like a hammer. The boy looked back to his mother again. Searching, drowning, but she wasn't looking at him anymore. Her face had changed. The softness was gone. The fear was gone. What remained was something colder, something sharper, something that understood the rules now. Across the room, Mrs. Collins watched in silence. On her wrist, the watch continued its quiet sweep. And for the first time since this began, none of them looked like a family anymore. The moment her face changed, you could feel it. Not anger, not grief, something colder, something that had learned the rules too late and was finally ready to play. She didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice came slowly, like it had to travel through years of denial to reach the surface. She admitted he was right. Her husband wasn't wrong about the numbers. Without him, everything collapsed. The house would go first, then the accounts, the routines, the illusion. There was insurance, yes, but not enough to preserve the life they had built their identities around. She would have to find work, though she had no idea who would hire a woman who hadn't needed to earn a paycheck in decades. They would survive, but survival wasn't the same as status. They would become invisible. She said the word ordinary like it meant extinction. Their son stared at her, his voice shrinking into something fragile. You can't mean that. He sounded young, not like a graduate, not like a man, like a frightened child. She turned toward him fully, and for the first time, she didn't look at him with protection. She looked at him with honesty. She reminded him of that night, of the drinking, of the car, of the boy walking home under streetlights, of how easily a life had ended, and how quickly they had erased it. She spoke about the lies, the money, the favors, the quiet destruction of someone else's name to preserve his. Her voice didn't shake. It emptied. She asked him what he had done with that gift, that second chance. She answered her own question. Nothing. He had wasted it. He had continued. More parties, more arrests, more carelessness. He had learned nothing. He had become nothing. Her words landed without heat, without cruelty, just fact. He made a small sound. It barely counted as speech. Across the room, the older woman watched. Her wrist turned slightly. 28 minutes. She had known this was coming. She had seen the truth years ago. Not in moments like this. In smaller ones. In interruptions. In dismissals. In the quiet ways they reduced each other when no one else noticed. This family had never been built on love. Only advantage. The senator stepped forward. His eyes locked onto the vial. His son moved instantly, blocking him. They stood face to face. Mirror images separated by time. Move, the father said. The son didn't. His fists clenched. His body trembled. He was stronger, younger, but strength meant nothing when you had spent your entire life being handled, being protected, being owned. He had never fought for anything. And now, he was fighting for his life. The air between father and son tightened until it felt like something solid. The young man's fists trembled, but there was hesitation in him. Violence was unfamiliar territory. Every time trouble had found him before, it had been erased by lawyers, by money, by quiet conversations behind closed doors. He had never needed to bleed for anything. His father was different. He had come from a world where survival wasn't guaranteed, where strength wasn't theoretical, where weakness got noticed. He knew exactly where to strike. Before either of them could move, her chair screamed across the floor. The mother stood. The sound of her heels cut through the silence as she walked around the table, each step precise. She had reached a conclusion. You could see it in her eyes. She began to speak, not about emotion, about perception, about what came after. Her husband hadn't thought far enough ahead, she said. He hadn't considered how it would look if he alone walked away from this. A man who lost his wife and child on the same night and survived. That wasn't sympathy. That was suspicion. That was something the public wouldn't forgive. He opened his mouth, but she didn't stop. If she were the one who died, she continued, the story would be cleaner, simpler. A grieving husband, a widower, a survivor carrying loss with dignity. People would embrace him. They would protect him. They would re-elect him. Her words landed. You could see the shift. Then their son spoke. Quiet at first, then stronger. If they were talking about image, he said, then maybe he was the answer. A young man losing both parents. Alone. Forced to carry their name forward. The tragedy would make him untouchable. People would rally behind him. They would see him as legacy, as continuation. He could step into his father's world. He could become something larger than himself. For a moment, he almost believed it. Then she laughed. His mother. It wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It shattered him. She told him the truth. He wasn't ready. He had never been ready. His life had been constructed for him, not by him. He didn't know discipline. He didn't know sacrifice. He barely knew himself. Her words stripped him bare. He denied it, but even he could hear the weakness in his voice. He lashed out desperate. She fired back, years of disappointment pouring out without restraint. Across the room, the father said nothing. He watched, listened, measured. He let them tear each other apart. Every accusation sharpened the distance between them. Every truth poisoned what remained. And sitting quietly, hands folded, she watched them. The second hand on her watch moved forward. Smooth, certain, unstoppable. They weren't arguing anymore. They were hunting, each of them trying to decide which life mattered most, and which one didn't matter at all. The sound came out of nowhere. A sharp, violent crack. Her hand had already fallen back to her side by the time he understood what happened. His mother had slapped him. For a second, no one breathed. He touched his cheek slowly, stunned, not by the pain but by the betrayal. Then something inside him snapped. He surged toward her, not striking, grabbing. His fingers locked onto her shoulders, shaking her, demanding something. An apology, a denial, anything. She answered with her nails. Her hands raked across his face, drawing thin lines of red that bloomed instantly. He shouted. She screamed. And the father moved. He seized his son from behind, wrenching him backward. Suddenly, they weren't people anymore. They were instinct. They slammed into the table. Glass exploded across the floor. Wine bled into the wood. The son twisted free and lunged toward the small glass vial. Freedom, hope, life. But his father caught him. His arm bent the wrong way. A scream tore out of him. His mother shrieked too, not in fear but in fury. They collapsed into each other again. Clothing tore. Breath came wild and animal. Decades of quiet resentment finally found its voice in violence. From her chair, the old woman watched. Still, silent, the father locked his arm around the boy's throat. The mother saw her chance. She grabbed the vial, clutched it to her chest like something sacred. The son broke loose, saw it, ran at her. She stumbled back. The father stepped toward her now. Slow, predatory. Give it to me, he said. Not pleading, ordering. He reminded her what she was without him. Nothing. Disposable. Replaceable. His words weren't strategy anymore. They were hatred. Pure. Unfiltered. Her face changed. Not fear. Not grief. Decision. She threw it. The vial spun through the air. For a moment, it seemed to hang there forever. Then, it shattered. Amber liquid splashed across the wall, ran downward. Gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. All three stared at the stain, at the broken glass, at the end of hope. Her voice trembled. Now none of us survive, she said. The father made a sound like something inside him had broken. The son dropped to his knees. His hands scrambled across the floor, trying to gather the impossible, trying to undo what couldn't be undone. But there was nothing to save. Only spilled liquid. Only broken pieces. Only the truth. Behind them, the old woman finally leaned forward. And for the first time that night, she smiled. The senator's voice dropped into something poisonous. He called her selfish, accused her of choosing death for all of them simply because she couldn't bear to lose. His wife answered with laughter. Not gentle laughter. Not sane laughter. It rang too high, too loud, breaking apart as it escaped her. Selfish, she shot back. You were ready to watch us die. On the floor, their son was still reaching, still clawing at nothing. His fingers slid through spilled liquid and broken glass, his mouth forming broken sounds that barely resembled language. He looked less like a man than something abandoned. The senator stared down at him, and in his eyes there was no love, only revulsion. Then he moved on, already adapting, already solving. He said they still had time. They could force the doors, break a window, find a way out. He spoke like this was an inconvenience, not a reckoning. His wife shook her head slowly. Those doors were built to keep danger outside. The windows were made to resist intrusion. He had insisted on it himself, to protect what was his. Now it protected her. He picked up his son's phone, studied it. Call for help, he said. She let him speak, let him imagine rescue. Then his wife asked the question that mattered. What would you tell them? That their employee had poisoned them, that they had destroyed their only chance to live while arguing over who deserved it most. Even if help came, what would be left to save? Silence answered. She watched them carefully. Then the wife moved toward the wall. Her fingers touched the streak where the liquid had run. She brought them to her nose, paused. Her face changed. Confusion. Recognition. The senator stepped forward, grabbing her hand. He smelled it too. His expression cracked open. Understanding poured in, followed immediately by rage. He turned. There was never any poison, he said. It wasn't a question. She met his eyes and told him the truth. No. The word hit harder than any weapon. Their son staggered upright, his face wet, his dignity gone. His mother made a strange sound. Not quite relief. Not quite horror. The senator stood perfectly still. Then he began listing the consequences. Threats, charges, prison. He promised to take everything from her. She listened. Then she smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly, honestly. And she asked him one simple question. Would he really stand in a courtroom and tell the world what they had done tonight? How they had begged, how they had chosen, how quickly they had been willing to sacrifice each other, how easily they had revealed the truth. She let the silence finish the thought. On her wrist, the watch continued its steady motion. They were alive, all of them, but nothing inside that room had survived. The room went still again. She held their attention like a conductor with a dark symphony. You think you understand danger, she said quietly, almost kindly. Let me tell you what real danger looks like. She reached into her pocket and produced another vial, identical to the first, amber liquid, thick and almost glowing in the dining room light. The hawthorn stared as though it had sprouted fangs. This, she said, voice steady, is what killed my son. Fentanyl, pharmaceutical-grade heroin, the exact concentrations planted in his system by your medical examiner. All lies, all calculated to erase him. The senator's jaw tightened. Mrs. Hawthorne slumped into a chair, the weight of realization pressing her down. Caleb's face twisted with pure, raw rage. No strategy, no pretense, just fire. She set the vial on the table. The gravity of it drew a hush over the room, a physical pull you could almost touch. It took me 11 months to gather this, she continued. Your son was careless, left things behind. Pills, powder, notes, numbers, I used them. I learned. I consulted a retired pharmacist, a man who'd lost his own child to this world and hates people like you. She paused, letting her words sink in. He taught me to measure, to dilute, to calculate dosage based on body weight, tolerance, to make it look like nothing more than a mistake, a heart attack, an accidental overdose, especially for someone with a history of indulgence. Her eyes locked on Caleb. You see this, she said. You've been living without consequence your entire life. But this is the real world. This is the only language some people understand. The amber vial sat on the table, dangerous, lethal, undeniable. And in that silence, the truth hit harder than any lie could. He didn't have a record, officially. His father had made sure of that. But she had everything. The expunged arrest, text messages, photos he thought he'd erased, every conversation, every bribe, every payoff, every calculated lie covering the hit and run that killed her son. She had been documenting it all for 18 months. Every moment he thought she was invisible, she was watching. Every time he whispered in his study while she vacuumed, she logged it. Every plan, every secret, they were all on record. She could end it now, right here. Drop the vial into his bourbon, watch him choke, alone and terrified the way her son had. And the world would call it an accident or a suicide. The senator didn't move, and for the first time fear touched him, pure, unmasked fear. She smiled faintly, not cruelly, but with calm authority. She wasn't a killer like them, not like their son. She retrieved her cardigan from the sideboard, put it on with deliberate, almost ceremonial precision. Every movement measured, unhurried. The Hawthorns watched, helpless. I'm going to do exactly what I said, she told them. In 17 minutes, these doors unlock. I walk out, never come back. And if anything happens to me, every document, every recording goes public. Do you understand? The senator nodded slowly, the effort in that single gesture raw and visible. And you, she asked, you'll do exactly what I say. Call 911. Say there's a medical emergency. Tell them your father overdosed on fentanyl. Get paramedics here fast with naloxone ready. She picked up the vial again. Before anyone could react, she uncapped it and poured a careful measure into the senator's bourbon. Not enough to kill, just enough. Just enough to terrify, to make him sick, to force him to feel helpless. He froze, his voice rose near hysteria. What are you doing? She explained calmly, almost gently. It was a cover story. He needed to drink it. She reminded him she wasn't a murderer. This dose would incapacitate, not kill, but it would demand intervention. And unlike her son, she was giving him a choice. Drink, or she would give him a lethal dose. Her hand didn't tremble, but her mind raced. Fentanyl was merciless. Intentions didn't matter. Tolerance, body chemistry, a dozen unpredictable factors. She couldn't control them all. The paramedics had to arrive fast. They had to be ready. And for the first time that night, the power in the room shifted. Not to wealth, not to titles, not even to family, but to her, the housekeeper who refused to be invisible. She had to get it exactly right. Every calculation, every microgram mattered. It was a gamble, the one thread of faith woven into a tapestry built on precision. She counted on their wealth, their address, the panic that would inevitably grip them, that luck would finally tilt in her favor. For a moment, she admitted to herself, she was like them, willing to risk another life to reclaim her own. The senator's hand trembled as he lifted the glass, eyes darting to his wife, then to Caleb, searching for guidance, finding none. He drank. Mrs. Collins spoke softly, laying out a story as carefully as a chess master positioning pieces. Under the pressure of the campaign, the scandals, the endless scrutiny, he had turned to drugs. Fentanyl, acquired through one of his son's reckless college acquaintances. His wife and son had found him panicked, confused, debating whether to call 911, worrying more about appearances than life. By the time help arrived, he was barely conscious. She watched Mrs. Hawthorne's mind engage, tracing the logic, seeing the plausibility. This narrative would explain the delay, the presence in the dining room, the senator's state. Embarrassing, certainly. Politically dangerous, yes, but survivable. The bruises, the chaos earlier, they'd fit neatly into a story of a man struggling during an overdose, restrained by family who tried heroically to save him. Sympathy packaged neatly, ready for public consumption. The senator's breathing slow, deliberate, measured, not yet life-threatening but noticeable. His eyes blinked slowly, focus waning. Mrs. Collins instructed Mrs. Hawthorne, clear and urgent, call 911, make it convincing. His life hung on the performance. Hands shaking, Mrs. Hawthorne seized Caleb's phone, dialing with trembling fingers, speaking the address, the emergency, pleading for help. She was a skilled actor when necessity demanded it. While the call connected, Mrs. Collins moved to the doors, unlocked them with a soft, precise click, the bolt sliding back like a whisper of inevitability. 58 minutes had passed. Close enough. The senator slumped in his chair, shallow breaths but alive, conscious yet unsteady, his gaze unfocused, lips moving without forming words. The fentanyl was working, enough to terrify, enough to warn, but not enough to kill. She leaned close, her voice low and intimate, audible only to him. She reminded him of David walking home that night, of the red light, the speeding car, the crosswalk. The moments he had tried to erase, the truth he had buried. And now, finally, she held the power to make him feel it. The hallway was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside, muffled through thick walls. The air was heavy, tasting of fear and old wood polish. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of the night press against her. In the dining room behind her, the Hawthornes were trapped in a silence worse than screams. Caleb, trembling, sat on the floor, hands pressed against his knees, trying to make sense of the chaos that had consumed his family. His mother stood frozen, eyes fixed on her husband, who was gasping, chest heaving, struggling for each breath. She hadn't come here to kill. That had never been the goal. Her plan was simple yet devastating. Force them to confront themselves, to tear at one another with the same ruthless disregard they had shown her son. She had wanted them to feel the corrosive weight of their own cruelty, to witness the monster behind the polished facade, and to live with that truth forever. She turned the doorknob slowly, the metal cold against her palm. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and uninviting, but it offered escape, freedom from the tension that had made the dining room a cage of rage and terror. One step at a time, she moved forward, every footfall deliberate, echoing faintly in the empty space. Behind her, the recording device rested safely in her bag, silent but deadly. It held everything, every word, every lie, every threat, every calculation. If anything were to happen to her, the world would know. Not just of tonight, but of every injustice Caleb had caused, every life he had shattered, every lie the family had buried beneath wealth and influence. She glanced back once. Caleb's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear, shame, and disbelief. Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze was locked on her husband, the senator, whose chest rose and fell with labored effort. She should have been calling for help, frantically trying to save him, but she didn't. She was calculating, assessing, weighing the cost of a life now balanced against decades of lies, greed, and deceit. Every thought, every emotion measured against the cold arithmetic of consequence. The senator's math had finally met its match. For the first time, Mrs. Hawthorne wasn't just a wife. She was a strategist, silently recalculating everything she thought she understood about her family. She understood that he had seen everything tonight. The scratches on Caleb's face, the shattered vial, the venomous choice laid bare across the table. She had destroyed the only antidote rather than let him claim it. She had argued, clawed, and maneuvered with precision. And now, she measured the value of her husband's survival against the weight of knowledge he carried. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound final yet strangely soft. The hall stretched endlessly, but with each step she carried the clarity of action, the fierce calm of someone who had endured the unendurable. The night was no longer about fear or revenge. It was about justice, distilled into its purest form. Caleb would live with the truth. Mrs. Hawthorne would live with the truth. And the man who had once controlled everything, who had built a world of appearances and power, would now live with the knowledge that he had been exposed and powerless to undo it. As she walked down the corridor, the faint glow of the streetlights outside flickered against the walls, painting her path in a pattern of shadows and light. Every step carried her further from the storm she had orchestrated, yet closer to the reckoning that would follow. Behind her, the Hawthorns remained in the dining room, suspended between rage, relief, and the crushing weight of reality. And she, for the first time in years, felt the strange, quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally turned the world's scales back toward balance. She slipped through the kitchen, the place where she'd spent 6 years crafting meals that cost more than her tiny apartment rent, past the mudroom stacked with outdoor gear the Hawthorns never touched, and moved toward the service exit she had used 1,000 times, always invisible, always unnoticed. The June evening air hit her, crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension she'd left behind. The brutalist mansion towered behind her, concrete and steel angles cutting into the fading light, a fortress designed to keep the world out, now powerless to contain the truth she had unleashed inside. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder. The Hawthorns would survive, she had made certain of that. The senator would be hospitalized, patched together with medicine and narrative, the story carefully spun into a version of reality that suited him. That's how they always managed things. But survival wasn't salvation. That family, if it could still be called that, had fractured tonight, torn apart not by an outsider, but by their own hands, their own choices. She hadn't destroyed them. She had only shown a light so bright they could no longer hide in shadow. She walked to her car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a dented passenger door, worth less than a month of the senator's salary, paid off 5 years ago. She slid into the driver's seat, the engine sputtering to life, and pulled onto the main road, leaving the fortress of false civility behind her. Thoughts of David pressed into her mind. The way he smiled, his terrible jokes, the careful way he saved his dishwashing wages to buy her that watch, the small acts of thoughtfulness and honesty that marked his brief life. The future he should have had, modest, unremarkable, real, had been crushed under the wheels of entitlement and arrogance. He was gone, erased by wealth and lies. She could not bring him back, but tonight she had taken from the Hawthorns something they could never reclaim: the illusion of goodness, the comforting lie that their choices were ever justifiable. She checked the rearview mirror. The mansion was shrinking, swallowed by shadows, a testament to what had occurred inside its walls. She thought of the senator's words about how some lives carried more statistical value than others, and of David, whose life had been calculated as nothing by people who never cared to see him. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel as she drove toward Silver Spring, toward her small, fragile life, now permanently marked by loss but fortified by truth. She would return to work. She had already lined up a new beginning, a life rebuilt from the fragments of the one the Hawthorns had shattered. And as the city lights blurred past her, she allowed herself a quiet thought. They might survive, but they would never again be blind. The reflection of their own cruelty would haunt them every time they looked in a mirror, a truth sharper than any consequences money could buy. And for once, she had delivered justice with nothing more than presence, calculation, and courage. Tonight, she had been more than invisible. She had been undeniable. She would wake up tomorrow in a small, quiet home far from the world that had taken her son. Each morning would carry the weight of grief, an ache that had become as permanent as a scar etched into her chest. But alongside that pain came a quiet satisfaction, because somewhere miles away, in a house that once felt untouchable, the Hawthorns would rise to a different reality. Their dining room, once a stage for polite conversation and practiced smiles, now held the memory of what had happened, the truth of their own choices etched into every polished surface. When they looked at each other, they wouldn't see mother, father, or son. They would see fear, selfishness, and the precise moment their illusions of decency had shattered. Justice, she realized, didn't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it came as clarity, as an unflinching mirror held up to people who had spent a lifetime pretending to be better than they were. Tonight, she had stripped away the varnish, revealed the calculations, the betrayals, the coldness beneath the veneer. The Hawthorns would survive this night. Their bodies would live, their fortunes intact, their status unscathed. But their reflection in the mirror, what they would see there in the silence after the sirens faded, would never forgive them. And that, she thought, was enough. Story 2, The Mirror Room No One Mentions. The package came on a Tuesday, and for reasons he couldn't quite name, that felt right. Not dramatic like Monday, not heavy with anticipation like Thursday, not weary like Friday. Just Tuesday, unremarkable enough to be ignored, yet quietly poised for secrets. The deliveryman had studied him with an expression that hovered somewhere between pity and professional neutrality, the kind reserved for men who collect stories from the dead. 3 crates, stacked like silent sentinels, now filled his cramped workroom. Each box was marked with handwriting he didn't recognize, the postmark local, which piqued his curiosity. He handled estate acquisitions frequently, but nothing recent in the neighborhood came to mind. Carefully, he pried open the first crate with the small crowbar that had belonged to his father, gloves snug against his hands to protect whatever fragile contents lay within. Inside were bundles of letters, tied with something that looked like black ribbon. But when he touched it, the material was off, soft, unnervingly warm, almost like skin or tissue. Each bundle contained dozens, perhaps hundreds of letters. No clear order, different writers, different stamps, spanning decades. He picked one at random, the ribbon clinging to his fingers for a heartbeat before releasing a faint warmth that lingered. The paper was thick, expensive, and the date read 1973. The letter told the story of a woman named Catherine, addressed only to someone identified as M. Her words were precise, intimate, and utterly confounding. Penrose Reed paused and read again, drawn deeper. He pulled another letter, 1985, signed J.K. The story differed in detail but carried an eerie echo of Catherine's experience. A third letter, 1991, continued the pattern. By late afternoon, he realized what he held: a decade-spanning chain of confessions, encounters with something unnameable, all written to the same silent correspondent. M, whoever M was, their replies were missing, or never existed at all. Penrose had handled disturbing histories before, diaries from institutions where cruelty was routine, ledgers that tracked human suffering, letters from couples whose love ended in violence. But this was different. It was as though he had stumbled into a conversation still unfolding, a dialogue that had never truly ended. He returned to Catherine's letter, the earliest account, drawn by a line about necessary distances that stirred a long-buried memory. His mother had said the same phrase years ago at a dinner party, explaining why she and his father maintained separate bedrooms. He had thought it odd then, merely a peculiarity. Now, sitting alone with Catherine's words, he remembered the long hallway of his childhood home, the echo of doors at opposite ends, the corridor stretching unnaturally, deliberately separating lives. The memory crawled along his spine with a chill. He shook it off and returned to the letter. Catherine's voice pulled him in, relentless and magnetic. The invitation arrived in March, which gave me 3 weeks to prepare. You know how I am about preparations. And just like that, he was inside her world, suspended between anticipation and dread, drawn into a story that refused to let him go. The list had been precise, almost ritualistic, everything meticulously noted for a weekend in a place I had never been. Comfortable walking shoes for the sprawling grounds, layers for the evening chill because the house, even in spring, seemed to trap a subtle cold. Nothing formal, ceremony wasn't part of their world. I'd known Manuva at university, though only in passing. She had that rare quality of seeming physically present but perpetually elsewhere, an air of distance that was both polite and unreachable. When she married Gerard Holt and moved to his Northumberland estate, it felt inevitable, her aloofness mirrored in the house itself. The estate, when I arrived, matched my imagination. A sprawling Georgian home, grand but not ostentatious, its gardens hinting at former care now softened by gentle neglect. Jar greeted me at the door. No staff appeared in sight, which seemed odd for such a property, but I kept silent. Jar was courteous, almost warm, though he carried Manuva's same ghostly distance. He took my bags and led me to my room on the second floor, a modestly luxurious space with a view over the gardens, a small fireplace already stocked, and a private bath. He explained that Manuva was resting and would join us for dinner, and advised me to explore the public rooms while steering clear of the older wings, deemed unsafe. I unpacked, arranging my belongings, then descended to wander the house. The public rooms were numerous but eerily similar: drawing room, library, morning room, each swathed in muted grays and browns, each furnished with expensive yet unforgiving pieces. Everywhere I went, it felt as though someone had just vacated the space, leaving only the echo of their presence. It was unsettling, but not unpleasant, like standing on the edge of a memory I wasn't supposed to recall. Dinner was set for 8. Manuva arrived, thinner now, almost translucent, her presence like a pale shadow of memory. We took our places at one end of the vast dining table, seats that could accommodate 20. Gerard at the head, Manuva and I flanking him. The meal was excellent, the conversation polite, yet strangely hollow. I found myself speaking of the weather, the journey, the grounds, the safe observations one makes to fill silences. Any attempt to probe deeper, to inquire about Manuva's work or Gerard's enterprises, was skillfully deflected. They answered certainly, politely, but the substance slid away as though swallowed by the air itself. The more I tried to anchor the discussion, the more it dissolved, leaving only the texture of the house and the faint, persistent sense of absence that hung behind every glance. Afterwards, dinner dissolved into a polite haze, the kind of evening that seemed full in memory yet empty in reality. We moved to the drawing room. Gerard excused himself after a few minutes, citing urgent work, leaving Manuva and me by the fire. I had imagined that now, finally, we could speak as old friends might, without the distance the house seemed to insist upon. She turned to me with a soft, almost guarded expression and said how pleased she was I'd come. She admitted that she and Gerard rarely entertained, preferring quiet, yet occasionally craving the faint pulse of human connection. Her words lingered oddly in the air, precise but unfamiliar, like a term remembered from a book she once read. I asked her if she was happy. The question slipped naturally from my lips. It had been too long since we'd last met. She gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes, careful and deliberate, and spoke instead about the necessity of distance. Too close, she explained, and one loses oneself. Too far, and one vanishes entirely from the other's world. They had found the balance, she said. I nodded, though unease prickled at my spine, sensing there was more beneath her words than explanation. Noticing my hesitation, she leaned in, an imperceptible weight to her movement that suggested either trust or a warning. She asked if I wanted to see the inner rooms. I should have declined. My body knew it. Tiredness might have offered an excuse to retreat, but there was something in her gaze, a mixture of need, secrecy, and something unspoken, that drew me forward. I agreed. She rose and led me across the drawing room to a door I hadn't noticed, painted perfectly to blend with the wall, its brass handle the only clue. She opened it, revealing a corridor that seemed almost unreal. Light filled it, yet shadows pooled oddly, edges soft and hard to focus on. As we walked, she explained that the estate held rooms they seldom entered, built by Gerard's grandfather for purposes that no longer needed attention. The corridors were lined with closed doors, each guarding what must be contained. She paused at one and placed her hand against the wood. This was my room, she said, pressing her ear to the door as though listening to some echo of herself. Inside lived the version of her that refused to maintain the distances, the self-insistent, demanding, untamed. My throat tightened. I could feel the weight of it pressing through the walls. She straightened and reassured me, soft but firm. The doors were built strong. Gerard's grandfather understood boundaries. Without them, identities would merge, dissolving into one another. These rooms kept what had to be kept. She moved to the next door, gesturing gently. This one holds Gerard, the part of him that wants everything laid bare, absolute intimacy. She had placed it there after the first year of their marriage, she said, and I felt a sudden desire to leave, but she positioned herself between me and the corridor's entrance, a silent barrier I couldn't cross. We continued down the hallway, her fingers brushing each door lightly. Some contained guests, she explained, people who had overstayed, who didn't understand the rhythm of the house. Others, fragments of themselves they could never fully reveal. She lingered for a moment, tracing the final doors as if acknowledging each presence. Each shadow kept safe yet unseen. There was comfort in her words, but a deep, unsettling weight beneath it. The architecture of secrecy, the deliberate separation of what could not survive proximity. The corridor seemed to stretch forever, a ribbon of shadow and pale light, each door a silent sentinel watching our passage. Every closed panel whispered its own rule, its own private story. I could feel them, the presences behind the walls, acknowledging our steps, approving the careful rhythms of civility we maintained in the public spaces. Their judgment was quiet, patient, almost indifferent, yet undeniably there. We reached the last door. It was different from the rest, newer, almost luminous in its pale wood. Manuela stopped and turned, her eyes sharp yet soft. "This one," she said, "is for you, if you'd like." Her voice carried a strange intimacy, a recognition of the loneliness I had tried so desperately to disguise in letters, in polite conversation. It was an offer I wasn't prepared to accept. Panic clawed at me. I bolted. The corridor seemed to shift and stretch as I stumbled back through it, across the drawing room and finally up to my bedroom. My hands fumbled with the lock, then the dresser. Barricade in place, I sank into the chair by the fireplace, every nerve taut, every shadow in the room amplified by the crackling firelight. Hours passed. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it, the handle turning, delicate and precise. A body leaning gently against the door, the weight measured, controlled. Then her voice, low and deliberate. "It's all right. The distance will hold." The words should have comforted me. Instead, a cold realization spread through me. Every guest room in that house adjoined an inner room. Thin walls, anything I had buried to maintain decorum, to present a composed self, had been listening. Every secret, every hidden tremor of fear or desire, knew exactly where I was. I left at first light while they still slept, or pretended to. The car hummed beneath me as I drove 6 hours straight toward London, each mile a retreat from the unnerving architecture of their estate. Later, I tried to write to Manuela to explain the impossibility of what I had witnessed, but the sentences refused themselves. Language buckled under the weight of what she had shown me. What could I say? That a marriage could make privacy tangible. That she had offered a form of care more terrifying than abandonment. I could not. Instead, I write to you. Whoever you are, you must know there are houses where intimacy has been solved, where the complexities of human presence, of other people, are given their own spaces, walls thick enough to contain them, doors strong enough to separate what must never merge. I am alone still, keeping my carefully measured distances, but now I wonder what I have truly kept out, and what I have locked away, unknowingly, inside myself. I set the letter down, hands trembling despite myself. I had read darker things, stranger confessions, letters of madness and superstition, accounts of the impossible, but Catherine's tone, rational and precise, made every revelation sharper, more disturbing. The clock read nearly 6 in the evening, and I realized I had been hunched over these pages for hours, neck stiff, shoulders aching, as if my body had tried to climb into the words themselves. The next letter lay waiting. dated 1985, signed by J.K. Masculine handwriting, deliberate and controlled, yet the words that followed promised the same unsettling intimacy, the same unnerving architecture of human connection, each line pulling me deeper into the hidden design of lives kept at a distance, yet intimately watched. The handwriting was precise, measured, almost surgical, a product of careful schooling and habit. Penrose lifted the letter gingerly, the weight of years pressing through the paper. From J.K. to M., September 1985. You asked if anything unusual has happened since I began the post, the letter began. I hesitated before replying, unsure whether to call it an event at all, or simply a series of impressions that might belong more to imagination than reality. Even as I write, I feel a strange resistance, not to truth itself, but to committing the ambiguity of it to paper. J.K. described the work first, in crisp, matter-of-fact sentences. They had been hired to survey the old recreation grounds on the northern edge of town, abandoned since the late 60s. Plans were whispered in council documents, housing, they said, though the term mixed use was written in a way that made it seem more like a charm than a plan. J.K.'s role was simple: map, measure, assess, and advise whether to tear down or preserve what remained. The grounds had once been expansive: tennis courts, a bowling green, a children's playground, a pavilion, and a curious building labeled the Assembly Hall, meant for dances and gatherings long forgotten. By the time J.K. arrived that August, 20 years of neglect had claimed it all. The tennis courts were fissured with weeds cracking the asphalt like veins. The bowling green had surrendered to wild grasses. Playground structures leaned and rusted, ominous in their quiet decay. Yet the Assembly Hall stood unyielding, locked but untouched, a sentinel in the overgrown field. The council had handed over the keys with a perfunctory warning. The hall had briefly housed emergency tenants in the 70s, abandoned again after complaints that were never fully explained. J.K. spent the first week wandering the grounds, tape measure in hand, jotting down notes, tracing boundaries. It was methodical work, soothing almost, though the place seemed to watch. Every shadow in the pavilion windows suggested a presence just beyond perception. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps approaching from empty courts. The second week brought the Assembly Hall itself. The key resisted at first, turning only with effort, and the door opened with a breath-like sigh, as if the building were exhaling after decades of confinement. Inside, the air was heavy but not foul. No rot, no dampness, just a timeless mustiness, the scent of absence sealed in. The main room stretched wide, 60 feet by 40, with a stage at one end, a bar at the other. The parquet floor was worn, splintering in patches, but the structure remained proud, the walls holding themselves straight against the years. J.K. paused in the doorway, senses sharpening. This place, empty yet complete, felt poised to speak. Every echo of footfall carried expectation. Each shadow along the wall seemed patient, aware. The survey was meant to be routine, clinical, but already the building was asserting its presence, an invisible occupant alongside J.K., insisting they notice not just the architecture, but the life that had once moved through it, the memories embedded in every corner, and the uncertainty of what might yet linger unseen. The parquet floor, though worn and nicked, still held a quiet elegance. Against the walls, chairs were stacked in careful, forgotten order, and at the center of the room sat a solitary record player, an antique with a heavy tone arm and built-in speakers, somehow waiting. Beside it, a box of vinyl records leaned casually, each one promising a fragment of time long gone. On a whim, curiosity, boredom, or some unnameable pull, I reached for one, a 1950s dance record, and placed it on the turntable. The machine still drew power from the wall. I flipped the switch. A low hum filled the space, and then the music began, crackling and distant yet unmistakably alive. And then the room shifted. Not a vision, not quite a hallucination, something stranger. The past bled into the present like two images overlaid on one another. Across the floor, couples twirled in careful, deliberate patterns. clothes and gestures from a different era, faces hazy yet animated with something like contentment. The world I knew fell back into silence the moment I cut the power, leaving only empty air and lingering echoes. I told myself it was imagination, a trick of memory and music. Yet I marked the record, the exact spot I had stood. It mattered, though I couldn't say why. The following day, I returned, surveying equipment in hand. Methodically, I revived the player and placed another record on the turntable. The room came alive once more, phantoms in slow, disciplined motion, oblivious to my presence. Over the week, I repeated the process, playing record after record. Each time, the shadows of dancers shifted slightly, their clothes, their arrangement on the floor, but the same ritualized precision endured. An unmistakable pattern emerged. Some figures returned again and again. A tall man holding his partner with rigid arms, a woman in a blue dress moving with mechanical accuracy, following a rhythm she didn't entirely trust. No smiles, no glances, just repetition, a silent choreography etched into the space itself. Then I found the unlabeled record at the bottom of the box, its surface marred with scratches. Hesitation crept in, but thoroughness is a professional obligation. I placed it on the turntable and lowered the needle. Nothing like music emerged. Instead, the sound was organic, a slow, collective breathing, as though the room itself inhaled and exhaled. And the overlay differed from all the others. The phantom couples remained, but frozen. They stood in pairs, facing one another, perfectly still, the air between them taut with unspoken tension. The music of movement had vanished, replaced by a pause that demanded attention, a suspended heartbeat of the room's secret life. Another pair stood at their prescribed distance, perfectly measured, as if guided by some unseen metronome. Slowly, inexorably, they began to inch closer, not hurriedly, not with any eagerness, but with the precision of someone following an instruction that could not be ignored. Step by step, the spaces between them collapsed. When they touched, the contact was tender, almost intimate, yet unnatural. Within moments, their separate forms dissolved into one, a fusion of edges and features that blurred until no individuality remained. The room filled with these hybrid shapes, human contours overlapped and multiplied, eyes and mouths overlapping in uncanny harmony. A deep, collective inhalation swelled around me, pressing against my chest, co-opting my own breathing as though the room itself had lungs. The merged figures rotated to face me, a kaleidoscope of faces that seemed aware, knowing, and patient. They had always known I would witness this, that the so-called abandonment of the recreation ground had never been about rot or decay, but about the room where separations end and boundaries fail. I yanked the record from the turntable and left the hall in silence, filing my report with a recommendation for immediate demolition. The council appeared relieved, no questions asked, no curiosity about my reasoning. But that sound, the inhalation, the collective sigh, still haunts me, echoing in quiet moments late at night. In crowds, on the underground, in crowded shops, I catch myself stepping back, maintaining the invisible buffer that protects against what I glimpse. That room had been a place where togetherness was rehearsed, perfected, and codified, until it became permanent. The phantom dancers are preserved in that exact moment when distance failed and merging began. I no longer attend dances. I avoid record players, and I guard my personal space with an almost ritualistic care, not from fear, but from knowledge. What happened there might still be happening somewhere, quietly, invisibly. The building was torn down in October, yet I remained skeptical that bricks and mortar could undo what had been forged inside. Some forms of connection, once established, outlive architecture. I am left uncertain whether to feel gratitude for this understanding or horror at it. Penrose rose and moved to the window, the empty street below bathed in the dim glow of evening. Shops were shuttered. His reflection stared back at him, pale and still, while beyond, faint outlines of distant buildings pressed against the fading light. A weight rested in his chest, a subtle, insistent pressure, as if something had burrowed inside and would not relent. Hours alone in the archive had always been his comfort. Now solitude felt alien, an uneasy companion that reminded him that some rooms, some knowledge, change you permanently. He felt it immediately, the subtle pull of space, the invisible contours around him, the measure of distance between his body and the walls, the door, the nearest human presence. Every step, every breath seemed calibrated against the emptiness around him. Somewhere beyond the city streets, the next letter waited, carrying with it another fragment of a puzzle he wasn't yet ready to understand. He approached his desk with deliberate caution, opening the envelope as if the paper itself might bite. From the letter of Imagine Clark to M, dated July 1991. I'm writing from a hospital room I barely belong in, though I can't explain why this feels necessary. Maybe putting words to it will make the events less mine, less immediate, less intimate. Maybe you asked, and I owe the attempt. I've been a university librarian for 7 years. It suits me, the quiet, the structure, the methodical rhythm of care. I am not built for conversation or social intricacy. Here, I can assist without truly connecting. I can interact briefly with precision without exposing anything of myself. Everything changed in late June. The summer catalog project began. A bequest arrived, boxes of books from a deceased professor's estate, and my job was to process them, inspect, verify, integrate. The work is pure, ordered, comforting, solitary with unambiguous criteria. I moved the boxes into the preservation basement, my little domain of stillness, and began sorting. The collection itself was ordinary yet extraordinary. Philosophy, theology, poetry, academic tomes, all well cared for, lovingly maintained. But by the third day, I noticed the first anomaly: heat. The books felt warm in my hands, as if someone had just touched them. At first, I blamed the stuffy basement, but the warmth persisted overnight, even after leaving volumes on the cold metal table. Each morning, they arrived as though freshly handled, alive with an unseen presence. Then came the scent, soft, insistent, and oddly familiar, like the lavender and lanolin cream my grandmother once used. It clung to my fingers after certain volumes, particularly the poetry. I washed repeatedly, but the fragrance lingered, subtle, unshakable, almost like a memory pressing through the present. The disruption escalated when I discovered the annotations. Not written in the books themselves, they were pristine, but appearing elsewhere as if the text had reached out beyond its pages. Symbols, phrases, marginalia that I hadn't made, handwriting that wasn't my own. Each note resonated with the tone of the text, echoing the author's thought, yet with a presence that was distinctly human, startlingly aware. He paused, the letter trembling slightly in his hands, the weight of it pressing against his chest. Hours of isolation, methodical and familiar, suddenly felt precarious. The boundaries between observer and observed, between past and present, seemed to waver. The books were no longer inert. They were witnesses, participants, carriers of warmth, scent, and secret messages. And as the city outside darkened, Penrose knew that whatever had begun in that quiet basement had not ended with the words on the page. It waited, patient, like a shadow behind every carefully measured distance, testing the limits of his own solitary control. The chair across from the table, I froze. The air felt heavier, charged, though no one else should have been there. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast oddly by the overhead lamp. Then the book trembled slightly, as if it had recognized the other presence. My pulse quickened. The figure, or whatever it was, did not move in the conventional sense. It seemed woven from the same quiet patience that had guided the annotations, the warmth, the scent. Not solid, yet unmistakably there. I could feel it in the space I occupied, pressing gently against my awareness. I stammered, "Who are you?" No voice answered. Instead, the handwriting appeared again, on a fresh examination form I hadn't yet touched. Small, precise, unmistakably helpful. I am what you leave behind when you think no one is watching. A chill ran through me. The room had become a companion, attentive, insistent. Every gesture I made, the lift of a pen, the placement of a book, was already known to it. I couldn't see it clearly, Yet every detail of the project bore its mark before I even acted. I realized then that the boundary I had believed existed between self and other, observer and observed, had dissolved. Days passed like this. I arrived each morning to forms partially completed, books aligned differently than I remembered, notes anticipating my thoughts. I tried to maintain my routine, my strict adherence to order, but the presence was relentless, intimate. Helpful, yes, but deeply invasive. I was no longer alone in my work. I was being guided, corrected, and watched by something I could neither define nor resist. The final incident left me shaken. I had been evaluating a fragile manuscript, one that could crumble with the slightest mishandling. I stepped away briefly to check a reference volume. When I returned, the book was open to the exact page I needed, with a marginal note already written. Advice I would have given myself had I thought of it. But the handwriting, it was not mine, yet unmistakably familiar. The room seemed to exhale, as though acknowledging my realization. I stopped speaking of it after that. Not because it ceased, but because there was nothing to explain, nothing that anyone could accept without doubt or fear. I moved through the library carefully, acutely aware of the invisible companion that had become part of every shelf, every page. Even now, long after the project ended, I catch glimpses of its presence, trailing warmth, faint scent, notes that seem to appear on forms I didn't leave out. And I wonder still whether I am the librarian maintaining the collection, or whether the collection is quietly, relentlessly maintaining me. I still remember the first moment I realized I wasn't alone in the basement. It wasn't a visitor, not exactly. It was me, my reflection, my twin in every detail, yet somehow wrong. Same height, same hair, same worn cardigan I favored when no one was around. Same posture I used when I thought I could finally be unobserved. Only this version of me didn't pretend. It didn't mask, didn't moderate. It existed in the way I never allowed myself to. She looked up, my own eyes staring back, and smiled. Not kindly, not warmly. It was the kind of smile that marks recognition of a problem that must be faced, unavoidable and absolute. She spoke quietly, almost matter-of-factly, telling me she had been here far longer than I imagined. All the hours I had poured over dusty pages, cataloging, arranging, filing meticulously in silence, they weren't gone. They had left something behind, something that had grown aware. She was the accumulation of my devotion, my solitude, the careful attention I lavished on objects instead of people. She was the part of me that thrived in patterns, in order, in the quiet architecture of the library, avoiding the unpredictable friction of everyday interaction. And now she waited, offering me a choice. I could reclaim her, she said, but only if I embraced the full weight of my own isolation. To take her back was to confront the truth of why I had hidden in the basement for so long, to feel the pull of the quiet I had spent a lifetime cultivating. Or I could leave her there, let her complete the catalog project in my stead, while I stepped into the world, the public side of the library, smiling at patrons, answering questions, guiding people I barely knew, maintaining civility at every turn. My solitude would be sacrificed, but the work, the sacred, meticulous, endless work I loved would continue without me. I made the choice that afternoon. I requested the transfer. The senior librarian's smile was approving, as if she had been waiting for this decision. She encouraged me to embrace interaction, to test my ability to function in the shared spaces I had so carefully avoided, and I obeyed. I have not returned to the basement since. My replacement finished the catalog project with a precision I can only describe as unsettling. Every form immaculate, every book accounted for, every annotation perfectly in place. She says sometimes, when the room is empty and the hum of fluorescent lights is the only sound, she feels another presence, someone who knows the library as intimately as she does, someone who remembers where every item belongs. I work now at the circulation desk. I greet patrons with polite smiles. I direct them to shelves and sections, answer questions about overdue fines, guide the lost through the quiet labyrinth of aisles. I am competent, efficient, socially acceptable, but I can feel her absence, the version of me I left behind. The part that loved the work more than it feared the world, that reveled in precision, in isolation, in the quiet authority of order. Sometimes, late in the evening when the library has emptied and the shadows stretch long between the stacks, I see her. A glimpse of someone who looks like me, moving silently between the shelves. Always distant, always turning away, never speaking. Perhaps she is the librarian I could have been, the one who chose devotion over appearance, work over expectation, the inner world over the outer. I do not regret the transfer. I know it was necessary. But I cannot help wondering if, in the quiet glow of the basement lamps, she regrets being left behind. And in those rare moments when I glimpse her shadow, I feel the weight of what was surrendered, the part of myself that belongs not to the world, but to the work that shaped me. I still think about it sometimes. The basement, the quiet, the faint scent of old paper and wax polish, the way the hours stretched without anyone noticing. I wonder if she thinks of me too, if she waits for me to return to the shadows I left behind. But I know I won't. Distance has become our safeguard. She belongs to the work and I belong to the world above. And yet, I needed to tell someone, M, that sometimes what we leave behind grows strong enough to live without us. The library still bears my name on the preservation room door. My successor once said it seemed odd, even wrong, that it remained. But she admitted that somehow the name fit the space, as if it had claimed a permanence beyond the flesh and the person. I don't go down there anymore. I've learned to accept the life above ground, fleeting conversations, procedural interactions, the measured civility that keeps me safe. But she is still there, immersed in the books, pouring into them the care I can no longer spare. On quiet days, I question my decision. Most days, I tell myself there was no real choice at all. Penrose set the letter down and rose slowly, his hand moving toward the drawer where he kept his small bottle. He poured a drink, steady at the surface, though somewhere deeper his body betrayed the tremor of unease, the subtle shift in heart and breath that makes a person aware of their own fragility. 3 letters, 3 lives, 3 testimonies of distance made tangible, of boundaries discovered, enforced, or abandoned, of human connection measured, manipulated, crystallized into something almost architectural, and all addressed to M, the silent recipient whose replies, if any existed, had been excised with surgical care. He glanced at the remaining bundles, dozens more letters, decades of experiences, each chronicling spaces where proximity became perilous, or intimacy too absolute. Spaces where the invisible architecture of separation had either failed or been maintained with relentless precision. But one bundle stood apart, larger than the rest, wrapped in that same unnervingly warm ribbon, and sealed with red wax embossed with the initials MH. Penrose broke the seal with deliberate care. Inside lay a single manuscript, dated 2008, titled The Inner Room, an account of the house on Belgrave Terrace. It was longer, richer, more deliberate than any letter he had read. The handwriting was unmistakable M's, the same hand that had received decades of confessions, cautions, and unanswerable truths. He leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him, and felt the quiet weight of night settle in the room. The hum of the heating system filled the silence, a low, persistent pulse. He began to read, and with the first lines, the world above faded. Outside, darkness pressed against the windows. Inside, each word drew him deeper into a house that had learned how to contain the human soul, to shape it with walls, corridors, and hidden rooms. He read of measured distances, the careful orchestration of presence and absence, of spaces where desire, fear, and need were all given architecture. Every page carried the echoes of lives observed, lives restrained, lives trapped within invisible boundaries that both protected and suffocated. And somewhere between the sentences, Penrose felt it again, the unshakable awareness that distance, once discovered, could never be forgotten, that it could linger in the air, in the wood, in the weight of a room, long after those who created it had gone. The basement, the preservation, the letters, they were all proof that absence could be as alive as presence, that what we leave behind could shape the world long after we had stepped away. He drank slowly, eyes tracing the lines on the page, the night outside swallowing the last traces of light. And in that darkness, he understood that some spaces are built not just for living, but for holding the parts of ourselves we dare not bring into the world. That some doors, once opened, never fully close. The first night I stepped across the threshold of Belgrave Terrace, the air felt different, thick with expectation, as if the house itself were holding its breath. 3 generations of my family had passed through this structure, but none had lingered long. My grandfather moved in with fanfare in 1952 and left 4 years and 7 months later, citing the neighborhood's decay. My father tried to reshape it into apartments in 1974, only to abandon the project after 6 months of frustrating negotiations with obstinate contractors. By the time it came to me in 2003, the house had been abandoned for nearly 10 years, left to collect dust, unpaid taxes, and a sense of subtle decay that only grows when doors stay locked and footsteps vanish. Selling would have been simple, profitable even, but the will was explicit. The house could only be sold after a family member had lived there for 5 years. The condition was strange, almost arbitrary, but it was binding. I needed the trust's funds, so I moved in. I was fragile then, or at least that's what my therapist called it, a professional breakdown, a collapse of tolerance for ordinary social interaction. As a lecturer, I excelled in prepared lectures, but the informal negotiations of colleagues, committee work, casual office banter, they left me drained, hollow, wary. Students asking reasonable questions felt like intrusions, small invasions that required constant vigilance. Belgrave Terrace promised distance, a buffer, a chance to exist without being worn down by others' presence. I would live cheaply, write the book I had delayed for years, and escape the unrelenting obligations of normal life. Isolation wasn't a punishment, it was treatment. I moved in during March. Professionals restored electricity, updated the plumbing, arranged enough furniture to make it functional. The house was bigger than I remembered. 4 stories, a basement, 5 bedrooms, reception rooms that resisted definition. The emptiness had left its imprint. Rectangular shadows of rooms stared like empty eyes. Corners held a faint chill even when the radiators hummed. Every surface seemed to measure me, as if the house itself were counting my hours, my presence, gauging whether I was worthy of staying. It was quiet beyond quiet, the kind of silence that makes the faintest sound, your own breath, a shifting curtain, loom large. Walking the halls, I felt the weight of every previous occupant, every family member who had come and gone without leaving a trace visible to the eye. And yet, somehow, the air was expectant, like it had been waiting for me all along. I realized quickly that this wasn't just a house. It was a repository for memories, for habits, for fragments of those who had lived here before. It demanded careful observation, measured steps, a consciousness that seeped into every corner. I was no longer merely inhabiting space. I was entering a structure that would reshape the way I understood presence, absence, and the delicate architecture of solitude. This was the beginning, not just of 5 years under a legal requirement, not just of isolation, but of something I could feel pressing at the edges of thought, something that would quietly teach me that distance, carefully maintained, can be more alive than proximity. Belgrave Terrace was not empty. It was waiting, patient, awake, and it wanted me to understand why. The room itself had been held in someone else's hands moments before. I froze, every instinct screaming that this was impossible, yet every sense confirmed it. The space was alive with familiarity and intent. The air smelled faintly of old ink and polished wood, the way the study always did after hours of work, yet here it lingered without explanation. I touched one of the manuscript pages. The warmth clung to my fingertips, almost like a pulse. My reflection in the window opposite shimmered oddly, not quite my own, as if the mirrored study had borrowed something of me to exist. I stepped back, but my footfall made no sound. Nothing stirred. Yet I felt watched not by eyes, but by a presence folded into the very walls, patient, waiting. Over the next weeks I became obsessed. Each day I returned to the mirrored room, noting every detail. The alignment of the books, the subtle marks on the desk, the faintest indentations in the chair cushions. It was my life inverted, my habits, my careful routines recreated with perfect fidelity, and yet not entirely mine. Something else lingered here, something aware. At night the dreams returned, growing more vivid. I would enter the mirrored study and see another self at the desk, writing, reading, adjusting papers exactly as I had. Sometimes the figure paused and looked up, just long enough for me to feel recognized, but then continued, absorbed in tasks I had performed countless times. The boundary between dream and waking blurred. I would wake with the warmth of pages on my hands, the scent of old ink still lingering, though my own study lay untouched. I began to speak to the house quietly under my breath. "Who are you?" No answer came, yet the mirrored study seemed to respond in subtle ways. A chair shifted slightly, a book leaned at a new angle, the manuscript pages turned by unseen hands. I started leaving notes on the desk, questions about process, about purpose. By morning, some had been answered in the same cramped, precise handwriting I didn't recognize as mine, yet somehow was. It became a rhythm, a dialogue with a presence that was my shadow, my echo, and something more. I realized the house did not simply reflect the past or my habits. It held them, repeated them, and perhaps learned from them. The mirrored study was a repository for the diligence, the solitude, the meticulous attention I had poured into work and life. It was alive with my absence, yet somehow more complete than I had ever been while present. And in that realization, a chilling clarity emerged. Distance, carefully maintained, had weight. It could be constructed, mirrored, made tangible. The house was teaching me the cost of isolation, the substance of separation, and the quiet, inevitable power of what we leave behind when we refuse to engage fully with the world outside our own walls. I first noticed it in the study. A chair pressed down as if someone had been seated moments ago, a faint curl of steam rising from a teacup I didn't remember setting out. My pulse jumped, and I left the room so quickly I barely remembered to close the door. When I returned an hour later, the wall was unbroken, flat, unremarkable, entirely ordinary. I told myself it was exhaustion, the manuscript weighing too heavily on me, too many hours alone, too many meals eaten without thought. Sleep-deprived imagination, I reasoned. But the next day, the phenomena returned. In the library, my usual reading chair bore the impression of someone who had just risen. In the bedroom, the other bed was rumpled exactly as I had left mine that morning. Everywhere I went, a mirrored presence seemed to occupy a hidden twin space, a shadow house overlapping my own. It wasn't malicious, not threatening. It simply existed, moving, arranging, living in rhythm with me without ever crossing paths. Panic flickered, but curiosity took hold. I began recording, mapping, cataloging each doubled room, noting patterns of appearance, warmth, and smell. A heat lingered on surfaces, faint perfume of aged paper, the subtle weight of a presence in the air. I realized the house had bilateral symmetry. My rooms on one plane, the mirrored rooms on the other, separated by something delicate, almost translucent, a membrane my presence had begun to thin. Logic demanded an explanation. Perhaps isolation had fractured my mind, my therapist insisted. "Return to the city," she said. "Seek other accommodations." But I couldn't dismiss the consistency. The patterns obeyed rules. Warmth concentrated in rooms I frequented most. Chairs were pressed down precisely where I had left them. Manuscript pages in the mirrored study were creased, ink smudged exactly as mine had been the day before. Something conscious, something patient and precise, was tracking me, reflecting me, shadowing my life without leaving my awareness. Days passed and I grew methodical. I no longer feared the mirrored spaces, I cataloged them. I began leaving small markers, a folded corner of a page, a misplaced pen, to observe how the unseen presence responded. Each morning, adjustments had been made, subtle but undeniable. The teacup was upright, the page unfolded, the chair nudged slightly. Whoever, or whatever, was inhabiting the mirrored rooms had a rhythm, an intelligence, and a patience that made my own meticulous habits feel almost trivial. I stopped questioning whether I was losing my mind. That explanation never fit. Instead, I began to feel the oddest sensation. The house had layered my life over itself, doubled it, and somehow made the echo real. It was no longer just a place to live. It was a partner in solitude, a reflection of habits and obsessions I had never fully noticed, existing in tandem with me, silent yet precise. And the more I mapped it, cataloged it, observed, the more I understood that the mirrored spaces weren't just copies. They were alive in their own right, conscious of boundaries, of distance, of the rhythms of my solitary life. By the fourth week, I moved through my home with a new awareness. Every step, every touch, every turn of the page in my manuscript had a counterpart. The warmth, the faint perfume of ink and polish, the indentation of chair cushions, they were evidence of a life parallel to mine, a presence that obeyed the laws I had unwittingly established. And in that realization came a quiet awe. The house had become something more than architecture. It was an organism, a living archive of my habits and obsessions, a mirror of self that refused to be ignored. I should have fled. I should have sold the property, broken the trust, escaped the quiet terror of duplication. But I couldn't. I needed to understand. And so I stayed, mapping, watching, cataloging. Each day brought subtle revelations. The mirrored spaces moved when I did, shifted when I paused, waited for my attention before responding. The boundary between reality and echo thinned, yet never vanished completely. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I realized the truth. The house did not need me. It only needed my habits, my presence, and my willingness to exist alongside its mirrored twin. The discovery changed me. I became patient in ways I had never imagined. I began to see solitude not as isolation but as dialogue, a negotiation with a silent, attentive partner. And late at night, when the lights in the house dimmed and the world outside grew distant, I would walk through rooms that were mine and not mine, and feel the quiet thrill of recognition. I was no longer alone, yet neither was I fully shared. Something else was there, precise, patient, mirroring the life I had carefully arranged, and in that I found both comfort and awe. The first time the house answered me, it didn't use words, it used temperature. Rooms I barely touched were cold enough to make my fingers stiff, but the rooms where I spent hours, writing, reading, breathing, held warmth long after I left, as if someone else stepped in the moment I stepped out. At first, I convinced myself it was poor insulation. Then I started finding things that didn't belong to me. A fountain pen I'd almost purchased years ago but never did. A cracked picture frame identical to one I'd thrown away after my divorce. Books I remembered owning as a student, long since lost. They appeared in the other rooms, the wrong rooms, the mirrored rooms. That's when the sounds began. Footsteps, always offset from mine. If I stood in the kitchen, something moved above me. If I climbed the stairs, something descended. If I paused outside a door, I heard movement retreating on the other side. It was like chasing my own shadow, except the shadow was always one step ahead. I tried to catch it. I changed my routine, moved unpredictably, waited in silence for hours. Nothing. It adapted faster than I could think. It wasn't avoiding me by accident. It was avoiding me on purpose. And then one morning in July, the house crossed a line. There was a note on my desk. Not in the other place. In mine. My desk, my study, my paper. My breath stopped. The handwriting looked like mine at a glance, but it was. It was too precise, too careful, like someone had practiced being me. It said only one sentence. We should discuss the arrangement. I didn't reply. I couldn't, because replying meant accepting that I wasn't alone. So instead, I escalated. I became unpredictable, ate at strange hours, entered rooms suddenly, sat in darkness without moving. Still nothing. No face. No body. Just distance. Perfect, intentional, absolute distance. And slowly, the truth began to sink in. This house wasn't haunted. It was designed. Every hallway curved, just enough to block visibility. Every staircase bent to prevent overlap. Every doorway positioned, so you could never see too far ahead. It was a machine built to keep two occupants from ever meeting. Which meant one horrifying thing. My grandfather had known. The 5-year requirement in his will. It wasn't sentimental. It was a sentence. Or maybe a test. With shaking hands, I went through the boxes he'd left behind. Old journals, receipts, letters. And buried at the bottom, I found something that made my stomach drop. A single page. In my grandfather's handwriting. 3 words. It learns you. I didn't sleep that night. Because for the first time since moving in, I realized something wasn't just copying my life. It was studying it, becoming it, and somewhere in the house, something was getting closer. I dug deeper into the basement boxes, sifting through decades of mundane records, deeds, tax forms, letters about neighborhood disputes. But at the bottom of the last crate I found it, a journal, yellowed at the edges, the ink dark and erratic, almost alive. My grandfather's handwriting sprawled across the pages, spidery at first, then increasingly jagged, as though the act of writing had become a struggle against something pressing in. The entries revealed a truth I hadn't been prepared for. He had experienced the same thing I was now trapped in, rooms that duplicated themselves, movements shadowed by someone unseen, a presence that mirrored and yet never intersected. But he had gone further. He wrote that the house didn't hold 2 occupants. It held one person, and that person's unavoidable separation. He theorized about human isolation. He wrote about the duality of self, the persona we perform for the world, and the private self that observes, judges, and hides behind the curtain of behavior. Most people integrate these selves through the constant friction of everyday interaction. Remove that friction, place someone in prolonged solitude, and the halves begin to split. The house, he said, made this split concrete, architectural. The mirrored rooms became containers for the unperformed self. All the desires, impulses, and thoughts suppressed to maintain coherence in the outside world. The longer one stayed, the more substantial this hidden self became, until it attained a terrifying independence. His final entry was dated the day before he abandoned the house. "I can hear it speaking now," he wrote. "It uses my voice in the rooms I am not in. It knows every thought I hide. It knows who I am when no one watches. 5 years completes the separation. I will remain performance. It will become truth. I leave before the distinction dissolves." I should have followed him. I should have fled, shattered the lease on my own containment, left before the architecture finished what it had begun. But curiosity anchored me. I wanted to see the end game. I wanted to understand what it meant when the separation became absolute. I began leaving messages for the other occupant, my unperformed self, if my grandfather's theory was correct. Simple questions at first. What do you want? What happens at 5 years? Why this house? The replies came slowly, impossibly, appearing on the very paper I had written on, in the same unnaturally precise handwriting. "I want what you deny me," it said. "Expression without consequence. At 5 years, the architecture becomes permanent. You live in performance, I live in truth." And in that moment, I understood. The house didn't merely reflect me. It was teaching me, shaping me. And somewhere in its mirrored corridors, my hidden self was already beginning to take form, patient, inevitable, waiting for the moment when the line between what I show the world and what I truly am would vanish entirely. The first time I realized the house was alive with its own purpose, I felt my chest tighten with a mix of dread and fascination. This place wasn't merely a building. It had been designed for one thing, to split a person in 2. My family had understood it long before me. Generations of deliberate isolation had left traces, architectural cues, hidden thresholds, mirrored rooms, all engineered to nurture separation until it became absolute. I asked quietly over the course of several days what had happened to those who completed the full 5-year residency. The answer came in handwriting that was precise, deliberate, almost clinical. They were still performing. They thrived in society, beloved by friends and colleagues, and yet hollow. No one noticed the void inside them. And then I began seeing them. Not ghosts, not apparitions, but echoes of people who had allowed the house to finish its work. In mirrors and darkened windows, sometimes in the periphery of my vision as I moved through the halls. They were perfect, always polite, always appropriate. Their smiles were exact, their posture impeccable. But when I looked into their eyes, I found nothing. No curiosity, no thought, no inner life. Just the seamless enactment of social expectation. My grandfather had escaped before this completion, slipping out before his unperformed self gained full independence. Others had remained. They'd surrendered entirely, leaving only functional husks, carrying on life without ever truly inhabiting it. By the time I reached year 3, I was deeply entangled in the house's rhythm. 3 years of living alongside myself, conversing only through notes left in mirrored rooms, mapping the invisible distance that defined our coexistence. I measured my every movement against the reflection of a life I could not touch, always precise, always parallel. Isolation had become my companion, silence my constant teacher. I should tell you I left, that I chose integration over separation, that I returned to the mess of human interaction with all its unpredictability and fatigue. But that would be a lie. I stayed. And now, approaching year 4, I do not fear the 5th. My unperformed self and I have reached an understanding. It will hold the truth, the suppressed desires, the selfish impulses, the raw, untempered parts of me I cannot safely release into the world. I will retain the performance, the version of myself capable of smiling at colleagues, teaching students, attending meetings, and navigating human spaces without depletion. Rationally, it seems elegant. The house has provided the architecture to solve what most humans wrestle with through sheer willpower, the balance between inner truth and outward function. I will teach again, interact freely, even enjoy the rare social exchange, all while the part of me that recoils from human presence resides in the mirrored rooms, synchronized with my every move, never overlapping, always maintaining the perfect distance. My therapist ended our sessions last month. She said I appeared integrated, healthier than I had in years, pleased with my decision to return to teaching. And yet, in the quiet moments late at night, when the house hums with the invisible pulse of parallel life, I feel the gaze of my unperformed self, a patient, inevitable shadow, and I wonder if true separation is a gift, or if it is merely the house showing me who I might become when no one is watching. The message was waiting for me when I woke up, placed neatly on the desk where I knew I hadn't left it. The handwriting was familiar now, no longer stiff or hesitant. It flowed with confidence, as if whatever lived beyond the wall had grown comfortable with its role. 1 year left. Thank you for your patience. Soon the performance will be perfect. I stared at those words for a long time, feeling something strange settle inside my chest. Not fear, not exactly, something closer to acceptance. My therapist had ended our sessions weeks earlier. She smiled when she said it, proud of the progress she believed I'd made. She talked about how I sounded stronger, more at ease. She praised my decision to return to teaching, to reconnect with colleagues I'd avoided for years. She said I seemed whole again. I didn't tell her the truth. I didn't tell her that the ease she sought wasn't integration. It was replacement. Because I could already feel it happening. Conversations that once drained me now unfolded effortlessly. I knew exactly when to smile, when to nod, when to laugh. The timing was flawless. My responses landed with precision. People leaned in when I spoke. They felt seen. But none of it came from feeling. It came from design. Soon I'll stand in front of a lecture hall again, speaking with passion I don't possess. I'll answer questions with warmth I don't experience. I'll attend dinners, maintain friendships, and play my part so convincingly that no one will ever suspect the truth. Because the truth won't be here. It will be living across the wall. In those silent, mirrored rooms, the part of me that cannot tolerate human closeness will finally be free. Free to exist without pretending. Free to think without filtering. Free to feel nothing at all. And I will be free too. Free from the burden of honesty. This house was never meant to shelter people. It was meant to divide them. To take the endless conflict between who we are and who we pretend to be, and give each version its own space to survive. We like to believe we are singular, whole. But we are. Every day we perform, we hide thoughts, swallow reactions, adjust ourselves to fit the expectations of others. This place simply finishes the process. It makes the mask permanent. I'm writing this now because you asked me to document everything. You said there were other places like this. Other structures where the boundaries inside a person could be stretched or broken. I don't know what you plan to do with this account. Maybe you want proof. Maybe you're searching for the same release. Or maybe you're wondering if such a separation is a curse. I can't answer that for you. All I know is this. If you've ever smiled when you didn't mean it. If you've ever pretended to care when you felt nothing. If you've ever felt like your real self was trapped somewhere behind your eyes, watching your life like a stranger, then you already understand why this house exists. My 5 years will end in March. The money waiting for me will be enough to leave, enough to start over anywhere in the world. But I won't go. I can't, because I know now, when the separation is complete, the person who walks out into the world won't be the one who suffered here. It will be the one who performs. And the one who suffered will remain. The walls are thinner now. Sometimes late at night, I hear breathing that isn't mine. Not beside me, not behind me, but exactly where I would be if I weren't here. The line between my performed self and my unperformed self has thinned to a thread so fine that removing the house's structure would be catastrophic. I wouldn't survive the collapse. This morning, my mirror self left one final message. Just 2 words, written in handwriting almost indistinguishable from my own, nearly complete. I should be terrified. I should resist this approaching fracture of my identity. But I feel nothing but relief. The endless labor of being human, the endless balancing, the pretending, the effort to make myself tolerable will soon end. The performance will go on. It will carry itself without me. And the part of me that has never been allowed to exist, the raw, unpolished truth of who I am, will finally have a room of its own. That is the house's purpose. It provides not comfort, not shelter, but space. Space for what we cannot admit to, for the selves we cannot integrate, for the truths we cannot bear to perform. Architecture for separation. My grandfather knew this. His father before him knew. And whoever built Belgrave Terrace, back when the street was young and London was still learning how to contain its new, modern lives, understood it too. I finish this account now and will place it with the others. You'll know what to do. You always do. For decades, you've been collecting these testimonies, mapping the spaces where human boundaries fracture, where ordinary social distance becomes something physical, measurable, architectural. I don't know what you intend to construct from them, but it must be necessary. Because if the house on Belgrave Terrace exists, if Catherine's hosts still maintain their inner rooms, if the recreation ground continues to hold its merged dancers, if Imagine's replacement still works alone in that basement, someone must understand the pattern. Someone must record where the architecture of human separation becomes literal. The 5-year mark approaches. I am ready. And when it comes, whatever walks, talks, teaches, and inhabits the persona of Malcolm Henning, know this, it will be flawless. The performance impeccable. The truth, however, will be elsewhere. Somewhere in a mirrored room, living quietly in isolation, unjudged, unobserved, perfectly alone. Somewhere the distance I have always craved can exist without effort, without compromise, without the endless, exhausting burden of pretending to be anything other than myself. The house will hold us, it always does. Penrose set the manuscript down as the clock in his study struck midnight. His fingers were numb, his shoulders stiff, his eyes raw from hours of reading Malcolm Hennig. Meticulously measured emptiness. He stood, stretching, letting the weight of the story settle like dust around him. And in that stillness, he understood. He paused, flexing his fingers, willing his body to respond, needing proof that he still existed in his own skin. The workroom felt different, larger somehow, as though the walls had quietly stretched while he'd been lost in the manuscript. He moved toward the window. His reflection stared back, framed by the darkness of the empty street beyond. Yet something was off. He stood left of his desk, but the reflection mirrored him to the right, not as he was, but as if it were showing where he should be. Turning back to the desk, he noticed a fourth letter resting atop the manuscript. He was certain it hadn't been there before. The envelope was addressed to him, not Penrose, but his birth name, the one he had buried in official documents years ago when he stepped into the antiquarian trade. Only his mother had ever used it. Only she, and she had been gone for 5 years. Hands trembling, he broke the seal. The ribbon clung with warmth, like it carried a pulse of its own, reluctant to release him, sticky in a way that felt calculated, intentional. Inside was a single sheet, brief but unmistakable, written in the flowing hand he recognized from his mother's diaries. Dearest, if you are reading this, the archive has found you. The time has come to understand the inheritance that has been waiting for you. The boxes you receive are not random. They are not mere collections of letters. They are a map, a record of those who discovered what you are discovering now. That isolation can be made architectural, that the distances we keep to survive sometimes take on physical form. For 40 years, I have collected these accounts, letters from those who stumbled into spaces where connection faltered or collapsed, where separation became as concrete as walls, where the act of being alone was amplified into something almost deliberate. Catherine, J.K., Imagine, Malcolm. These are not isolated events. They are symptoms of a deeper structure, a hidden feature of modern life that occasionally reveals itself in certain rooms, certain houses, certain configurations of space. Your father and I learned the truth in our marriage. That is why we slept apart, why we cultivated what I called necessary distances. Proximity eroded us. To share space was to dilute ourselves. The farther we remained, the more fully we existed, and eventually we were no longer sharing the same. The words hung in the air. Beyond the ink and paper, something unspoken pulsed, a design older than him, a law of rooms and separations that had been waiting for him to see. Keep to survive have taken shape in walls, hallways, staircases, where separation becomes tangible, almost literal. You'll find it in the basement, stacked in boxes, each ribbon bundle a testament to the lives caught between performance and truth. Hundreds of letters, decades of experiences, all chronicling the spaces where ordinary connection fails, where human presence cannot penetrate without consequence. I am leaving this to you not as a gift, but as a choice. The archive can continue, and with it, the work of making these invisible boundaries visible. But know this, by taking it on, you step closer to your own fracture. The line between the performed self, the one that smiles, that nurtures, that exists publicly, and the unperformed self, the one that desires solitude, that observes, that is honest without compromise, will begin to solidify. The architecture will do what upbringing alone could not. It will make your separation structural, inevitable. You can walk away. You can burn it, erase it, refuse the inheritance, and try to merge those selves before the house, or what it represents, locks them apart forever. Or you can step in, catalog it, learn it, embrace it. Let the archive map your path as it has mapped others. Let the letters guide you into a world where human boundaries are no longer abstract, where the distance we require is made permanent by walls, doors, and corridors. I cannot tell you which is right. The performed part of me urges caution, safety, reintegration. The real part, the one you will never meet outside the margins of these documents, knows you are already halfway there, and that the house, the letters, the archive will complete what your own childhood began. I am no longer fully your mother, only the fragment trained to write warmth on paper, to show care in handwriting, to maintain the illusion. The rest of me has long since become a witness, a cataloger, a solitary presence in mirror rooms, watching truths that no one else can see. The choice is yours. The basement holds the answers, the archive waits, and the house, whatever it is, stands ready to provide the space where you will be forced to confront the separation you've inherited. Penrose held the letter in his hands, reading it again and again, each pass reinforcing a truth he had long suspected. His mother had never truly been present, only performing the role of parent with precise, deliberate care. Millicent Henning, name changed, duties performed, emotions contained, had lived entirely through measured architecture, floors, rooms, boundaries that managed her connection to the world. Human contact had never been natural for her. It was a burden, a thing to be organized, separated, and contained. He remembered his childhood in that house. Separate floors for his parents, their warmth always just out of reach, gestures that taught him early that intimacy was a performance and distance was survival. He had learned young that meaningful relationships existed only behind buffers, books, papers, documents, objects that could mediate human interaction without risk. He was already living that lesson in miniature, in his trade as an antiquarian, surrounded by the remnants of lives long gone, where he could exist without the draining weight of ordinary presence. The choice his mother outlined wasn't a choice at all. He had been shaped for this work since birth, cataloging, documenting, mapping the invisible architecture of isolation. The basement archive awaited him exactly as she had described. Filing cabinets stacked with letters, journals lined on shelves, boxes full of photographs of houses, rooms and spaces where human boundaries had materialized into architecture. Decades of testimonies, hundreds of lives charted, all proving that the distances people kept weren't metaphorical. They had rooms, floors, entire wings to themselves. Penrose descended into the basement and began the work. Hours turned into nights, nights into weeks. He organized, cross-referenced, mapped. Each story, each letter, each journal was a node in a lattice of human separation. He continued his mother's project not out of choice, but out of inevitability. It was a path prepared for him since the first moment he understood that performance and truth could exist in the same body, yet never touch. He pulled the first file from the cabinet, carried it upstairs to his workroom, and noticed his reflection in the window. For a moment, it seemed to be standing slightly out of sync, a reminder of the mirror spaces he'd inherited. Then, as if acknowledging his acquiescence, it aligned perfectly. It didn't matter. What mattered was the work. Every testimony preserved, every house mapped, every account of rooms that housed suppressed selves. This was the inheritance he could finally claim. He opened the first file and began to read, and somewhere deep inside, a part of him that could still feel more than relief acknowledged its permanent separation. The archive would grow. There were more houses like Belgrave Terrace, more mirror rooms like the ones Catherine had glimpsed, more invisible spaces where unperformed selves lived, waiting to be documented. His mother had begun the work. Now he would carry it forward. The distances would be maintained. They always were.